The Turpin house did not announce itself as a place of horror from the street. It blended into a quiet California neighborhood where lawns were trimmed, mailboxes upright, and neighbors learned to look away as a matter of habit rather than malice. David and Louise Turpin presented themselves as devout, disciplined, and private. They homeschooled their children. They spoke about faith, obedience, and order. 13 children lived inside the house, spanning toddlers to adults, yet the home made almost no sound. No children rode bicycles down the driveway. No teenagers lingered on the sidewalk. Silence became the first warning sign no one truly heard. Inside, time collapsed into a long, indistinguishable stretch of days governed by rules that were never written but always enforced. The children learned early that rules did not exist to guide behavior, but to justify punishment. Food was measured and withheld. Sleep was rationed. Movement required permission. Mistakes were not corrected. They were recorded, remembered, and repaid later. Some of the children were shackled for months at a time, chains cutting into skin as bodies grew thinner. Others learned to hold their hunger quietly, to slow their breathing at night, so as not to attract attention. The house functioned less like a home than a closed system, designed to break resistance by exhausting it. What made the Turpin case uniquely unsettling was not just the cruelty, but the duration. This was not an explosion of violence followed by regret. It was a routine. Years passed. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Children became adults without ever being taught what adulthood meant. Some victims, legally grown, had the emotional and physical development of children half their age. They did not know what medicine was for. They did not know how money worked. They did not know that what was happening to them was illegal, only that it was constant. David Turpin controlled the household with rigid authority, reinforced by religious language and the threat of punishment. Louise Turpin, equally involved, enforced the rules and participated in the abuse. Together, they built a narrative that framed suffering as discipline and obedience as virtue. The children were told that the outside world was dangerous, that authorities would separate them, that no one would believe them. Over time, fear replaced curiosity. The idea of escape became abstract, almost imaginary, like a story from a book they were never allowed to read. Neighbors noticed things, but not enough. They noticed pale faces behind windows. They noticed odd behavior, like older children who seemed unable to speak to strangers. They noticed the family's isolation. What they did not see were the chains, the starvation, the punishments carried out behind locked doors. In a culture trained to respect privacy, suspicion rarely matures into action. The Turpins benefited from that silence. For the children, isolation was total. Education consisted of sporadic, inadequate lessons that ensured dependency rather than growth. Medical care was almost non-existent. Illnesses went untreated. Injuries healed improperly, or not at all. Teeth decayed. Muscles weakened. Bodies learned to conserve energy because food might not come. Hunger became a permanent condition, not a temporary discomfort. The children learned to eat slowly, to savor crumbs, to hide what little they were given in case the next meal was delayed or canceled as punishment. Punishments themselves were unpredictable, which made them more effective. A minor infraction real or imagined could result in days of restraint. Chains and padlocks were not symbols. They were tools used routinely. Being restrained meant not only physical pain, but humiliation, the slow erosion of dignity. It meant being watched and judged while helpless. It meant learning that resistance was futile and compliance did not guarantee safety. And yet, within this system, something fragile endured. The children formed quiet bonds with one another. They shared glances, whispered reassurances when they could, and memorized each other's suffering. These bonds did not overthrow the system, but they preserved a sense of humanity that the rules were designed to erase. In the darkest moments, those connections mattered more than food. As the years passed, the gap between the Turpins' public image and private reality widened. The parents continued to present themselves as responsible, religious, and orderly. Authorities were never called. Schools were never alerted. The children grew up invisible. This invisibility was not accidental. It was cultivated. Isolation protected the abusers far more effectively than any locked door. By the time the eldest children reached adulthood, escape seemed almost impossible. They lacked money, knowledge, and confidence. They had been taught to fear the outside world more than their own suffering. Even imagining a life beyond the house felt like an act of betrayal, punishable by consequences they understood all too well. The parents relied on the psychological confinement as much as the physical restraints. What ultimately made the difference was not strength, but desperation. One of the children, a 17-year-old girl, reached a breaking point where fear of staying outweighed fear of leaving. She had secretly accessed a phone and object as forbidden as it was powerful. She did not have a script. She did not fully understand how emergency services worked. She only knew that she needed help, and that if she waited any longer, she might lose a chance forever. Her decision was not sudden. It was the product of years of accumulated pain. Every missed meal, every night restrained, every moment of watching younger siblings suffer pushed her closer to that moment. When she finally dialed 911, her voice was hesitant, unsure, but clear enough to carry the truth across the distance between the house and the outside world. She described siblings chained, starved, trapped. She gave an address. That call did not just request help. It challenged years of silence. It forced a confrontation between the carefully maintained image of a family and the reality hidden behind its walls. For authorities, it would lead to a scene that required no embellishment to shock. For the children, it marked the first irreversible step toward freedom, one taken with shaking hands and no guarantee of safety. In that moment, the Turpin house was still standing, still quiet, still pretending to be ordinary. But the system that sustained it had cracked. The silence that protected it was about to end. When authorities arrived at the Turpin home, they did not immediately understand the full weight of what they were seeing. The house was cluttered, but not obviously violent. There were signs of disarray, piles of belongings, an oppressive stillness, but nothing that prepared them for the human reality unfolding room by room. As officers moved deeper into the house, the rules that had governed life inside began to reveal themselves. Not through written lists or posted warnings, but through bodies, behavior, and fear. Some of the children emerged cautiously, thin to the point of distortion, their movements tentative as if expecting punishment for stepping forward. Others were found restrained, shackled to beds or furniture, unable to stand on their own. The restraints were not improvised in panic. They were deliberate, secured with padlocks. This was not a moment of chaos frozen in time. It was evidence of system that had been used repeatedly and without urgency to hide it. The children's ages ranged widely, yet many appeared far younger than they were. Adult victims struggled to articulate their thoughts, their vocabulary limited, their understanding of the world fragmented. This was not intellectual disability in the clinical sense. It was deprivation. Education had been withheld as thoroughly as food. The parents' version of homeschooling ensured dependence rather than learning. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught inconsistently or not at all. Curiosity was discouraged. Questions were treated as defiance. Daily life followed a rhythm that prioritized control above all else. Food was the most effective weapon. Meals were irregular and small, often consisting of items with little nutritional value. Portions were measured carefully, not to ensure fairness, but to enforce obedience. Hunger was constant. The children learned to negotiate internally with their own bodies, to suppress pain, to normalize weakness. Some scavenged for scraps when they could. Others learned to drink water to quiet the ache. Bathroom access was controlled. Showers were rare. Cleanliness, like nourishment, was treated as a privilege rather than a necessity. Illness did not alter the rules. Injuries did not excuse compliance. When a child became too weak to stand, the response was not care but restraint. Chains ensured stillness. Stillness ensured silence. Punishments were layered and psychological. Being restrained was not only about preventing movement. It was about visibility. Children were left in positions where they could be seen by siblings, where humiliation became part of the lesson. The message was clear. This is what happens when rules are broken, and everyone will watch. Over time, the fear of causing harm to siblings became another form of control. Resistance risked collective suffering. Sleep offered no refuge. Nights were unpredictable. Lights would remain on. Restraints could tighten. Hunger intensified. The children learned to exist in a state of hypervigilance, listening for footsteps, monitoring tone of voice, anticipating moods. This constant alertness etched itself into their nervous systems. Even when nothing happened, their bodies remained braced for impact. The parents justified these rules with moral language. Obedience was framed as righteousness. Suffering was reframed as correction. The children were told that authorities were dangerous, that foster care was worse than their current lives, that separation would be permanent. This narrative did not need to be logical. It only needed to be consistent. Over time, it replaced the children's own instincts. Fear of the unknown became more powerful than the pain of the known. Isolation ensured the system remained intact. The children had no peers, no teachers, no doctors, no relatives who intervened. Social interaction was limited to siblings and parents. Without comparison, cruelty became normal. Without witnesses, abuse became routine. The outside world existed only as a threat described by those who controlled access to it. When officers assessed the children, medical professionals quickly recognized severe malnutrition. Body weights were dangerously low. Muscles had wasted. Bone density was compromised. Some victims had not received basic medical or dental care for years. Their bodies told a story of prolonged neglect, one that could not be explained away by poverty or misunderstanding. This was deliberate deprivation, sustained over time. The parents' reactions did little to obscure responsibility. There was no confusion, no urgency to explain injuries or conditions. The rules they had enforced so strictly inside the home offered no defense once exposed to scrutiny. The narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence, chains, locks, malnourished bodies, and testimonies that aligned with chilling consistency. As investigators documented the scene, the scope of the captivity became clearer. This was not one child abused while others were spared. It was a household structured around domination. Each rule reinforced another. Hunger weakened resistance. Isolation eliminated escape. Fear prevented disclosure. Together, they formed a closed loop that sustained itself for years. For the children, the removal from a house was disorienting. Freedom arrived suddenly, without preparation. They were taken to hospitals, examined, fed carefully to avoid medical complications. Some were frightened by abundance, unsure how to respond when food was offered without conditions. Others apologized reflexively, even while being treated, expecting reprimand for existing. The rules that had defined their lives did not disappear the moment the door closed behind them. They lingered internally, shaping reactions and expectations. Authority still felt dangerous. Choice still felt risky. The system of captivity had been dismantled physically, but its psychological architecture remained intact. What investigators uncovered in the Turpin home forced a reckoning with how easily extreme abuse can persist when hidden behind privacy and belief. The rules were not chaotic or impulsive. They were methodical. They were designed to erase autonomy slowly enough that resistance never fully formed. Understanding those rules mattered, because without that understanding, the case risked being dismissed as an anomaly rather than recognized as a warning. The house itself became evidence, but the deeper evidence lived in the children's conditioned responses, the way they flinched, the way they waited for permission, the way they struggled to imagine a future not governed by punishment. Those responses testified to years spent learning the same lesson over and over again. Survival depends on obedience. By the time the house was emptied and sealed, the rules that had once defined it were finally broken. But their consequences would follow the victims long after the physical space ceased to function as a prison. The 911 call lasted only minutes, but it carried the accumulated weight of years. The girl on the line did not speak with the confidence of someone rehearsed or prepared. Her voice wavered uncertain, as if she were testing each word to see whether it was allowed to exist. She did not use dramatic language. She did not need to. She said her parents were hurting her and her siblings. She said some of them were chained. She said they were not allowed to eat properly. She gave an address. For the dispatcher, it was an emergency. For the caller, it was an irreversible act. That call fractured the internal logic of the Turpin household. For years, the children had been taught that reaching out would only make things worse. The outside world was portrayed as cruel, unbelieving, eager to separate and discard them. The call challenged that story in real time. It was not fueled by hope so much as necessity. The girl had reached a point where the risk of punishment no longer outweighed the certainty of continued suffering. When law enforcement arrived, the parents were present. There was no attempt to flee. The house did not erupt into chaos. This absence of panic was itself revealing. The system had functioned for so long without interference that its architects did not immediately grasp that it had ended. They had relied on obedience, fear, and invisibility. None of those held once the door was opened by someone they could no longer control. The discovery unfolded slowly. Officers encountered victims who struggled to understand instructions. Simple requests, "Stand here," walk there, caused confusion. Some children asked permission before speaking. Others stared at the floor, conditioned to avoid eye contact. The physical evidence was undeniable, but it was a behavioral evidence that conveyed duration. These were not reactions to a recent trauma. They were learned responses to an environment where autonomy had never been permitted. Medical responders recognized the urgency. Malnutrition at this level required careful intervention. Refeeding syndrome posed a risk. Bodies long deprived cannot simply return to normal intake without danger. Even rescue demanded caution. The irony was difficult to ignore. Care itself had to be rationed because deprivation had been so extreme. As the children were transported to hospitals, they carried with them a mixture of fear and disbelief. Some cried. Others remained eerily calm, unsure how to respond to kindness without conditions. One child reportedly asked if they were in trouble for calling the police. The question was not rhetorical. It reflected a worldview where seeking help was synonymous with wrongdoing. Investigators began assembling a timeline, piecing together years of neglect and abuse from sparse records and victim statements. Birth certificates existed. School records did not. Medical histories were fragmented or absent. The gaps were telling. Each missing document represented a year in which oversight failed to penetrate the family's isolation. The parents were arrested and charged with multiple counts, including torture and false imprisonment. The language of the law struggled to encompass the scope of what had occurred. How do you quantify years of hunger? How do you measure the theft of childhood? The charges addressed actions, but the harm extended beyond any single offense. Public reaction was swift and intense once details emerged. Images of the house circulated. Reports described chains, locks, malnourished bodies. The contrast between the family's outward appearance and the reality inside ignited outrage. Yet beneath the shock lay uncomfortable questions about how such a situation could persist unnoticed. The Turpins did not live in isolation from society. They lived within it. For the children, the immediate aftermath of the rescue was overwhelming. Hospitals were bright, loud, filled with unfamiliar faces. Choices were suddenly abundant: food options, clothing, schedules. Freedom arrived without instruction manuals. Trauma does not recede simply because danger has ended. It adapts, finding new forms. Some victims struggled to sleep without restraints, their bodies conditioned to stillness. Others hoarded food unconsciously, hiding in pockets or under pillows. These behaviors were not signs of ingratitude. They were survival strategies that no longer had a context. Unlearning them would take time, patience, and resources. The 911 call became a symbol, but symbols risk oversimplification. The call did not save the children by itself. It initiated a process that would expose both cruelty and systemic shortcomings. Rescue was only the first step. Recovery would be uneven, shaped by trauma and by the adequacy or inadequacy of the systems meant to support them. As the legal case progressed, the children's voices entered the public record through statements and testimony. They described being chained for extended periods, being denied food as punishment, being isolated from the world. Their accounts aligned in ways that left little room for doubt. Consistency replaced secrecy. The girl who made the call did not emerge as a hero in her own eyes. She emerged as someone who had done something forbidden and survived. That distinction matters. Courage, in this context, was not performative. It was quiet, shaking, and uncertain. It did not promise victory. It demanded risk. By the time the parents entered the courtroom, the narrative had shifted irrevocably. The house that once functioned as a closed system was now evidence. The rules that governed it were now crimes. The silence that protected it had been broken by a voice that had been taught not to speak. Yet even as justice moved forward, it was clear that the consequences of the captivity would not end with sentencing. The call opened a door, but what lay beyond it was complex and daunting. Freedom, for the Turpin children, was not a conclusion. It was an unfamiliar beginning. The courtroom offered a version of order that the Turpin children had never known. There were rules, but they were written, visible, and constrained by law. There were consequences, but they followed evidence rather than impulse. When David and Louise Turpin stood before the court, the imbalance of power that had defined their household was finally reversed. They were no longer arbiters of punishment. They were defendants. The charges reflected the scale of the abuse: multiple counts of torture, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. Each count represented not a single moment, but a pattern sustained over years. In victim impact statements, the children described hunger that never ended, chains that cut into skin, fear that shaped every decision. Their words were not embellished. They did not need to be. The restraint in their language made the content more devastating. In 2019, both parents pleaded guilty. They were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after decades. The sentences acknowledged severity without pretending to offer closure. No number of years could restore what had been taken. The courtroom recognized guilt, but it could not return childhoods or undo neurological and emotional damage caused by prolonged deprivation. Public attention shifted quickly from the trial to the question of recovery. The rescue had generated outrage. Rehabilitation required patience. The children were placed into state care, scattered across foster homes and facilities. This dispersal, intended to provide safety and individualized attention, also separated siblings who had relied on one another for survival. Bonds forged in captivity were suddenly strained by distance and bureaucracy. Freedom exposed new vulnerabilities. Many of the victims lacked basic life skills. Some could not read at an elementary level. Others did not understand how to use money, navigate transportation, or make medical appointments. Trauma manifested in anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting caregivers. The world demanded competence from people who had been deliberately denied the chance to develop it. Investigations later revealed failures within the support systems meant to protect them. Promised services were delayed or insufficient. Financial assistance was mishandled. Advocacy groups raised alarms about neglect following the rescue, neglect of a different kind, quieter but consequential. The transition from captivity to independence proved more precarious than the public narrative allowed. These shortcomings complicated the idea of rescue as a clean ending. The Turpin case became not only a story about abuse, but about what happens after exposure. It forced a confrontation with the reality that removing victims from harm does not guarantee healing. Recovery requires sustained investment, coordination, and accountability elements that were inconsistently present. For the children, progress unfolded unevenly. Some learned quickly, driven by determination and curiosity long suppressed. Others struggled, overwhelmed by choice and haunted by conditioning. Success could not be measured by conventional milestones. Simply learning to say no, to express preference, to trust kindness without expecting punishment, these were victories invisible to outsiders. The public's role shifted from witness to participant, whether consciously or not. Attention faded. Headlines moved on. But the consequences of the Turpin household continued to unfold in therapy rooms, classrooms, and quiet apartments where former captives tried to construct ordinary lives. Their stories did not resolve neatly. They persisted. The Turpin case endures because it resists simplification. It is not only about monstrous parents or heroic escape. It is about how control can masquerade as discipline, how isolation can be mistaken for privacy, how systems fail when suffering is hidden behind closed doors. It is about a phone call that broke silence, and about everything that silence had allowed to happen before it was broken. In the end, the house was just a structure. The true crime lay in the years it took for anyone outside to listen.